Late in March of 1981, Reagan was shot and almost killed in an assassination attempt. And when he was recovering from his wounds, he told Cardinal Cook, who visited him, that he believed that he had been spared to do something. And what it was he wanted to do was rid the world of nuclear weapons. I think it was a much more powerful vision than the anti-communist vision, because if everybody kills everybody, what difference does it make whether you're a communist or a capitalist or a conservative or a liberal? Ronald Reagan was a mediocre student, and that's probably being generous. He was interested in girls and football, and he had a fascination with acting. So a friend suggested that he do a screen test, and the studio just lost a good-looking young actor who Reagan somewhat resembled, and they had an opening, and Reagan was hired. And for several years, he played the heartwarming role of himself. You know, if you look in life, a series of coincidences can sometimes help.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee.
I do not believe that the communist has ever at any time been able to use the motion picture screen to the social welfare against that of any industry in the United States.
Reagan had joined some groups that communists allegedly had taken control of, and he became fundamentally anti-communist. When the House Un-American Activities Committee investigated, he really walked a fine line. On the one hand, he denounced communists. On the other, he wouldn't name names, which I think shielded him from a lot of the later criticism of people who did name names. Reagan was a Republican in spirit before he became one in name. In 1960, he supported Nixon, but he didn't want to become one of these professional Democrats who's used as a Democrat who endorses the Republicans. He converted in 1962. During the course of Nixon's run for governor of California, he re-registered Republican. When he was running for governor, there was kind of odd mixture to him. On the one hand, he thought he could really do a good job as governor. On the other, he was painfully aware, I think, that he didn't know enough about state issues. He'd always thought in terms of national issues, and there was a real effort to get him up to speed. After he'd been governor for 2 terms, people came to him and wanted him to run against Senator Alan Cranston. Reagan wasn't interested at all. He didn't want to run for senator. He'd already decided he wanted to run for president.
The time is now. The time is now for Reagan. Reagan for president.
When Reagan was running in 1980, the Republican establishment did everything in its power to stop Ronald Reagan from becoming president. They all ran against him: Howard Baker, Bob Dole, George H.W. Bush. They said he was too old. They implied that he was too right-wing. They spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to defeat him. And whatever else you can say about Reagan is he earned his way. He defeated all of these guys. Reagan didn't run for president as the embodiment of the conservative movement. He ran from the center. He quoted FDR in his acceptance speech.
And then he said, "I propose to you, my friends, and through you, that government of all kinds, big and little, be made solvent, and that the example be set by the President of the United States and his cabinet."
He didn't come in as a bristling partisan. There was a feeling of general optimism, and what I base that on is that the approval rating for Ronald Reagan went up between the time he was elected and the time he took office. And from the moment he took office, you had a civil society that was working the way it was supposed to work. John Gaddis called Reagan a saboteur of the status quo, and he listed others in that group, Margaret Thatcher and the Pope. These were people who, for one reason or another, moral, political, or religious, didn't accept the prevailing doctrine of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The notion that you could forever sustain the peace by having 2 highly armed powers on hair-trigger status ready to destroy the other countries is a truly mad idea. Reagan thought that there could be a change in this permanent fighting between the Soviets and their allies or satellites, and between the United States and its allies. The Soviets were building missiles at a ferocious rate. Reagan campaigned on building up our military forces so we would be better able to counteract the Soviets. And someone asked him if the military buildup that he was proposing wouldn't cause a greater arms race. And Reagan, in effect, replied yes, that it would, but that he thought that the Soviet Union would come to the bargaining table.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
To the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was essentially an idea that you could put up a missile defense system that would shoot down or destroy incoming Soviet missiles. It wasn't scientifically feasible, but it scared the hell out of the Soviets. They did one thing, and they did it very well. They built these big, heavy, land-based ICBMs, and the Soviets had no way of competing with us in this. What changed in the second term were two things. One was that the buildup was over. It had been completed. And then along came Gorbachev. He was the first Soviet leader who didn't talk in terms of destroying the United States or the imperialist capitalist countries. He was practical. They met in 1985 in Geneva. They didn't have any great thing they accomplished there, but pushed the ball along in the sense that they agreed to meet again. They couldn't decide whether to do Moscow or Washington next, but they hit upon Reykjavik as a midpoint. It was an island, so you could obviously have good security on it. It wasn't supposed to be a major summit. It developed a life of its own because Gorbachev came there with this idea of introducing this plan of getting rid of nuclear missiles in return for the United States killing SDI. Reagan was moved by this anti-nuclear vision, so it became a seminal meeting.
Mr. President, have you made any real progress, sir?
And they were very, very near agreement, but Reagan at the end walked out. Immediately afterward, everybody said it was a terrible failure. Then they came home, and I think for political reasons, both Reagan and Gorbachev had to represent this supposed failure as a triumph.
There is much work to be done. Mr. Gorbachev will visit the United States later this year, and I look forward to showing him our country.
Because they thought that Reykjavik had advanced the goals of nuclear arms reduction, and pretty soon they were on the road to doing that. Agreed at this at the Moscow summit, and then in '88, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty. And always remember, this is the first agreement in the history of the Soviet Union and the United States that reduces nuclear arms. I think that Reagan rose to the occasion. When it came down to the rubber meets the road part of it, Reagan was a national leader. Ridding the world of nuclear weapons is still the most powerful idea in the nuclear age, and no two people did more to advance it than Reagan and Gorbachev.